So, hello, I'm Jen with Studio 304 Stew, and this is my really good old friend. Not that she's old, but my old time friend. I've known her for a really long time. My friend Kerry Cobuccio. Hi, Kerry. Thank you for
Hi.
joining us. So I invited Carrie to chat with us today because of her experience as a composer and a sound designer, and I thought she could really give us some interesting perspective with the work that she's done and dabbled with in the industry. So we'll head it over to Carrie to introduce herself.
Okay. Well, I guess I'll start at the beginning. So, as a kid, I was exposed to computers and I was exposed to music at a pretty early age. At around probably the age of 3 or 4, my dad brought home an IBM 5150 personal computer that had the two 5 1/4 inch, floppy drives,
Nice.
and it he also got me a bunch of edutainment computer games. A lot of them were by this company by the name of Spinnaker. I'm not sure, they probably don't even exist anymore. But so I had introduced to computer games at a pretty early age. But then also we had a few like arcadey video games. My dad was really into flight simulators, so we had whatever version of Microsoft Flight Simulator was around in the early 80s. And I got exposed to Pac-Man. That was probably the first video game I remember playing that's considered like a traditional video game. And I was terrible at it, but I had a lot of fun.
I'm still terrible at
Yeah.
it.
But I had so much fun playing it. So the computer side of things, it's been around for me since almost day one. And same kind of with the musical side of things, my mom got me a toy piano at around that same age, like around 3 or 4. So I was messing around with music, and we eventually got an upright piano at the house when we moved from Nashua to Merrimack. So that was kind of always there. So it wasn't really a big surprise when I decided to join band in the 5th grade. My maternal grandfather played the clarinet and the saxophone, so that kind of resonated with me. So when trying all the musical instruments, I ended up it was recommended that I try clarinet. So that's how I started with getting into band and continuing that all throughout high school. And I found that I really enjoyed that. I got more and more into music as I got older. And it was actually one of my dad's friends, who is also coincidentally a music teacher, that recommended to him that I check out the Summer Youth Music School that's hosted through the University of New Hampshire. And it's a summer music program that's for middle school and high school age. Obviously, this year they did not have it, but it normally is during the summer in late July and early August. And I attended that for 3 summers, and that was probably at the point where I really knew I wanted to be involved with music. And then from there, as I went to the University of New Hampshire for my undergraduate. Let's see. So on the other side of things, I was still like getting more and more into video games. When I was 9, I got a Nintendo Entertainment System for Christmas. So, and that really opened up the doors for me as far as like getting into more like traditional video games. And it came with Duck Hunt and Super Mario Brothers, and I got really into those. And then first I tried out Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest. And around the same time, I don't remember which one I played first, but that was my first introduction to role-playing games set in kind of the fantasy setting, and the music was a little bit more sophisticated. And that started my interest in getting into role-playing games, particularly Japanese role-playing games. And then eventually over time, as I got exposed to more and more of them, I became even more passionate about them. And I was really drawn to the music that was in those, because it was also a very orchestral, like traditional symphony orchestra sounding kind of music. So it was kind of both the computer world and the classical music world were kind of, going on at the same time, connecting. And I always kind of in the back of my mind thought, man, it would be great if I could actually do something with this. And I would hear musical ideas in my head of stuff that I wanted to jot down after listening to so much video game music. But I didn't have the musical training to really know how to put that on paper per se, at least not at first. And it wasn't until the last year that I attended the Summer Youth Music School that they had a composing class that was taught by one of my future composition teachers when I was at UNH, Mike Anacarico. And it was the first year that they had something like that. And I thought, well, great, he can teach me how to write music. That's awesome. Great. I'll do this. And that was the start. And then I spent probably most of our senior year just writing and playing around in computer music software. I'm spending just hours. My dad had got me at around that time my very first digital audio recording software, and it was called Cakewalk Pro Audio. This was about a little over 20 years ago. And
I'm sorry, I gotta interrupt for a moment because I gotta know. How does that compare to like Pro Tools or like Logic, like programs that you use now?
There's definitely a lot of similarities. The company that made Cakewalk Pro Audio, I believe they call their notation, their digital software Sonar now. And then basically that's just a competitor to Pro Tools and Logic and Cubase, and there's plenty of others. They all work very similarly. So that was kind of my first introduction to that. But I had
you kind of got introduced, like your dad hooked you up with like some actual like real software. It wasn't like the MS Paint of like of, like composing. That's awesome.
Yeah, and then when I was in high school, it was, I think, one of the music theory classes. Our music teacher, our mutual music teacher, Mr. Dougal, had introduced us to some notation software. So the software that's used to actually be able to write out the musical notes, print out a part, give it to somebody to play. And I was introduced to Finale, which is a name of one of the software notation software programs, and that's the one that I still use to this day. And eventually my dad also hooked me up with my own copy when I was in college, and I've been using Finale ever since. There are other notation programs out there. There's Sibelius. Since iDevices have become a thing, there's been a lot more that have popped up, and I actually do want to try to mess around and experiment with some of those. But if I'm doing some work that involves printing something out or transcribing something, I use Finale now because that's what I work the fastest in. That's what I'm the most comfortable with. So yeah, I even both, classical stuff, writing out music and printing it, and then also messing around with stuff. Yeah, my dad definitely hooked me up with that sort of stuff. And a lot of my ability to any degree of tech savviness that I have is definitely because of my dad, who was a computer programmer. And so, yeah, going back to Cakewalk Pro Audio, I would import MIDI files that were made by people, and it was mostly MIDI files of video game music. And I would listen to what's going on, and I would sometimes adjust the volumes. Essentially, what I was doing was mixing.
So this is like a post-production kind of stuff.
Yeah. So basically, like, the idea of adjusting volumes, making some edits, making some tweaks. Sometimes I would change the MIDI instrument that was used because I wanted it to try to sound as close to the original as possible. And sometimes the MIDI mixes that people were making, they didn't sound quite right. So I was trying to essentially fix them, so to speak. And again, still had no idea what I was doing, but it was good practice to just experiment, and then from there I started writing stuff on my own, and it was a lot of bad music, but it was just but that's what you got to do when you're first starting, is just trying things and seeing what works and what doesn't work. And the first actual piece that I had written where people played it was a little trio for 3 clarinets. Clarinet's my main instrument, so it's also good to start off with an instrument you're familiar with. And it was this little musical introduction that was performed at the beginning of a Shakespearean play that was put on by one of the local community theater groups. that was near us growing up in New
Oh,
Hampshire.
cool. That
Yeah.
must have been a really cool feeling to like watch people performing the music that you composed.
That's also a very eye-opening experience too, when you hear other people play something of yours, because you obviously have the ideas in your head, but if the music, when you give them the sheet music, if not all of that information for what you want is communicated, sometimes it won't sound exactly like you hear it in your head. So it's also the experience of knowing that you're giving all the information, or maybe you hear it and once it's played by live players, you're like, I don't really like how this sounds, maybe I want to tweak this. And so it's kind of a collaborative experience. So yeah, I mean, a lot of stuff from high school like really like supplanted what my interests were and then going forward. So I went to college at the University of New Hampshire. I started out as a music education major, and I realized pretty quickly by the end of my freshman year that I knew that I enjoyed teaching, but I was more interested in teaching more advanced stuff and teaching music theory primarily, than instead of teaching fifth graders how to play snare drums. So I ended up switching my major to music theory, and I had the plan that I was going to go get advanced degrees and hopefully teach college level. That was kind of the change in goal, instead of being a public school teacher. So I did that. I took composition lessons when I was at the University of New Hampshire, and then I was also playing clarinet in ensembles. And then eventually I went to grad school at the University of Minnesota, which is in the Twin Cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And I went there specifically to study with one particular teacher by the name of Judith Zamont, who has since retired. She no longer teaches there. But I specifically knew that I wanted to work with her. And I would say for looking at graduate school, that is probably a big thing as far as like what you want to be looking for, is finding a teacher that you connect with and that you'll actually really gain a lot out of. And yeah, I connected with her right away. So that was kind of the impetus to going there. And that was really just focusing in on improving my skills as a composer. And she kicked my butt every week, and it was exactly what I wanted and what I needed at the time. So I learned a lot, and I was spending probably on average between 3 and 6 hours a day writing, and then also doing homework for my classes. But then at the same time, if I wasn't doing that, I was probably playing video games still.
I relate to this lifestyle.
Yeah, so there was still definitely that interest in video games, and like that, those were kind of my two things. Like those were my hobbies, but those were also like what I knew I wanted to do. Like I still had that interest in wanting to incorporate video games and being part of like a group of people that's coming together and making something that people enjoy, so there was that kind of interest. But also at the time, video games were not as mainstream as they are today, and certainly video game music wasn't as celebrated as much as it is today. They were just starting to have concerts where live musicians were playing music for composers. I think the Dear Friends concert series was probably one of the first ones that I remember, and that featured the music from the Final Fantasy series by the composer Nobuo Uematsu. And just starting to hear some of that stuff. So I kept my interest in video games kind of on the down low, because I wanted to be sure that I wanted to be taken seriously as a composer. So I kind of casually mentioned my interest, but I didn't really play it up as far as how interested that I was. And that didn't come until after I had finished my master's degree. So we now fast forward a few years to finishing my master's degree. And my now husband at the time, he was at the University of Michigan working on his PhD in chemistry. And his advisor announced literally the weekend before I was going to then move to Michigan with him, we had just gotten engaged, that he had been offered a job to teach at the University of California, Los Angeles, and teach in their chemistry department. And that if the students wanted to continue study with him, they would have to move to Los Angeles or start over. And the combination of not wanting to start over, but then me also looking at that as, hey, this is an opportunity that's now been handed to me on a silver platter. I can explore the options that California has to offer, like we should do it. And UCLA paid for our move and we packed everything up. So in total, I lived in Michigan for about 6 months. I taught at a community college teaching music classes to fill up the time. And then I moved to California in early 2006. So I've been now living in California for the last 14 years, and it's been a very slow climb since I've been here. I spent probably the first couple of years just meeting people and getting a feel for like what tools I needed, what knowledge I needed, kind of get it exposed to the entertainment industry on all different sides. I spent some time interning and working with a couple of film composers who do work today, and get learning experience from them. I ended up learning how to use Digital Performer and learning how to use Logic, which are both also digital audio workstation software similar to Cakewalk Pro Audio, which I mentioned earlier. They each have kind of their own different quirks, and some of them work better than others on certain things. So I got exposed to that. I started meeting people. I also first started going to the Game Developer Conference, which is normally held in San Francisco either in February or March every year. And that's a great opportunity to meet people in the video game industry and get a chance to network and just be exposed to what there is, and meeting the people and stuff. And so at the first year I met a whole bunch of different composers and kind of gained some insight on where those people were at different stages in their careers, and a lot of exchanging of business cards and stuff like that. And as I was introducing myself, we're now talking 2007, 2008. So this was right before the iPhone came onto the scene. And so mobile gaming was just about ready to erupt. And so there were a lot of developers that were starting to make mobile games, and a lot of them, that because they're working on mobile games, they have smaller studios, they have smaller budgets. So they'd look at my work and they'd say, oh, hey, great that you write music. Can you do sound design? And of course, my answer at that time was, no, I can't do sound design. And so then it became pretty clear to me that if, as a way to try to keep getting work, you need to be able to, you don't need to be a jack of all trades, master of none, but you definitely should try to specialize in at least a couple of different things. So that way, in between, periods of where you get a lot of composing work versus then some downtime, maybe you start getting a lot of sound design work. And I saw that in action with one of the film composers that I interned with. It was kind of the same thing for him, where he was doing film music, but he also did teaching. He had a new music ensemble that he was part of. So he was doing a couple of different things, and that allowed him to keep his days busy. And I think that's really key to having success out here. It's not just about like becoming famous and being a superstar. Like, yes, there are those people, but for the vast majority of people, that's not realistic. So you got to find like the few things that you really excel in, and then hone in on that. That was the big thing that I learned from him. So I started to, look at the possibility of going back to school, which I did about a decade ago at this point. And that's when I started learning about sound design. I picked up Pro Tools, which you mentioned Pro Tools earlier, which is, I'd say, probably like the premier audio editing software that's used in the entertainment industry. I would say people probably use Pro Tools more than any of the others. So even if you don't like Pro Tools, at least having some basic knowledge of Pro Tools and understanding how it works, how the formats work.
It's kind of like Photoshop, where you gotta work with Photoshop at some point if you do anything with digital art.
Yes, exactly. So So I learned how to use Pro Tools. The school that I was at also had a game design program, so I got in touch with them and got in touch with the game design students and assisted them on their student projects, and just at first just doing music, but then as I got more comfortable with sound design and taking classes in Pro Tools, I started doing that as well. So then I had some student projects. Towards the end of my time in school, I got an internship working for Seismic Games, which is in Los Angeles. They now go by Niantic Los Angeles, I believe. And I was doing sound design for the games that they were working on.
That's really familiar. Niantic.
Pokemon? Yeah, Pokemon Go.
Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, I was interning there, and eventually I got hired after I was done school, and I worked there for a while, and then eventually moved into doing freelance stuff, which is basically where I'm at right now, where the last few years I've been doing freelance work with smaller indie studios, which for me personally, I find that that's what I prefer to do. I prefer working with the small indie developers. I like that small collaborative experience. And so I've been doing a mix of composing music for things and doing sound design for stuff. It's almost exclusively mobile games, but of course I think that's a great place to start off.
Well, thanks for getting us up to speed. I do have to just say, every time you say clarinet, it reminds me of how we first met.
Yes!
Because we met because I was playing clarinet in the school band, and I accidentally took Carrie's clarinet home, and so that's how we ended up meeting. And you introduced me to role-playing games and really sparked a love of video games and video game music for me as well. So thank you for that.
Yeah, I remember that very vividly. The day that I went to go get my clarinet, because we had them stored in the music room, and I couldn't find my clarinet, but then I happened to notice that there was one other clarinet whose case was the same as mine. So I thought maybe whoever that is, maybe they took my clarinet. And then I looked at the ID and I saw
you're right.
A number. I think I also took your clarinet home to make sure that it wasn't just like stuck at the school. And I called you at your home phone number, and I just said, "Hi, you don't know me, but I think you have my clarinet." And that's what started our friendship. I think it's a great story.
It not only sparked a love of video games for me, but because we shared a lot of the same favorite games, and you got me really into the JRPGs, the Japanese role-playing games. I fell in love with the anime manga style, and I really wouldn't have fallen in love with it otherwise, and that's what that's what made me pursue art and comics and animation, all that. So it's amazing what a good video game will do.
Yeah, thanks to my dad getting me into computers at a young age.
Yeah.
And the other thing, going back to high school, one of the other memories that really resonated with me was during our sophomore year, when we were involved in a children's musical called Free to Be You and Me. Do you remember that?
I remember working on a musical, but I don't remember it being that name. But
yeah, it was called Free to Be You and Me. It was a children's musical, and the idea of it is that it's this huge book of all these different children's stories and songs and skits, and you pick a bunch of them and then use that as a performance. There is actually a video. I don't know how. It'd probably be pretty hard to find nowadays. It was made in the 70s. And it was put together by Marlo Thomas and a bunch of other singers and actors that were big in the 1970s. And they did their own version of Free to Be You and Me. It had a very young Michael Jackson in it, I remember.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, this would be pretty hard to find nowadays. But what I loved about that experience was that we had all of us coming together and doing all these different little skits. Like, some of us did some singing, some did acting, some played musical instruments. And it was that collaborative process where everybody was important. Everybody was part of this one big creation that we performed for little kids. And I remember them really enjoying it. And that was something that I, especially looking back on it, even, very fondly, that I just loved that experience, that collaborative experience. And I think that then transcends over into working in entertainment, working on film projects and working on game projects, because it's the same idea that you have a group of people and everybody is doing something and every part of it is important, whether it's doing the art or whether you're doing level design or even just testing the game as a QA tester, testing to make sure that the game is working properly and that there aren't any game-breaking bugs. Like, that's still a very important part of the process. And everybody comes together to make this one thing. And it's something that then people can enjoy. So that being another thing that really shaped what my interests were in the future and wanting to go the direction that I have gone into.
Do you feel like you get more of that that spirit of like collaboration with the indie games or the smaller companies than with like working with a larger? I don't know how large Niantic is, because they used to be pretty small, I think, before they got Pokemon Go and stuff.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, Seismic Games was basically an indie studio. It was an indie studio that was put together, I believe, by people that had formerly worked at Pandemic Studios, which got bought out by EA around the same time that BioWare also got bought out.
I have thoughts about that phrase, got bought out by EA. I have strong thoughts about that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, we've talked about that.
Cringe.
Yeah, so like people that have worked in the industry but wanted to work in the smaller environment. And I personally haven't really worked with a AAA studio. Everything that I've heard has just been experience from other people that I've worked with that have worked in AAA studios. And especially with the recent climate in the game industry that's been going on recently, with a lot of information has been coming to light of the working conditions at a lot of the bigger studios that isn't particularly the most ideal of situations. They're definitely, that's a completely different issue, but it made me not so interested. I think, if that is what you're interested in and, that's where you want to go, I think there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. It's just, for me personally, I found that I didn't want to work in that kind of environment. I also care a lot about a work-life balance. That's also very important to me. And I decided pretty early on, after my now husband and I moved to Los Angeles, that I cared about that and I wanted that to be a priority, even if it meant that I was doing smaller things, that I didn't become as famous or made as much money. To me, that was more important. So I think also the priorities, if you don't have to worry as much about work-life balance, then maybe getting a job working for the AAA in a AAA studio and putting in those hours, especially if you're younger, like that might be a great thing for you. Maybe someone thrives in that environment. So I don't want this to sound like I'm, bashing the AAA studios. I just, for me personally, that's not what I wanted.
I understand kind of the points that you're making. I feel like I went through, like when I was doing graphic novels, it was very hard to have a life outside of doing the graphic novels because it was just so work intensive to make those types of deadlines. And now, like, I'm kind of amazed that I can have a full-time job and I can raise a son and I can still work on projects. Like, I don't have to just do one thing and do that one thing, like, every waking hour of my day. And I personally also find that life to be a little bit more fulfilling, I guess. Like, when you put all your eggs into one basket, it can get, I don't know, my perspective could get kind of a little twisted, or being so laser focused, and sometimes, like, depending on how my work was received or the environment that I was in, I could really lose perspective of, like, I don't know, more things to do in life or more ways to define myself as a person.
And I think at different stages in your life, your priorities are different too. So I think you can decide, maybe for a few years you do that laser focused thing and you live on 3 hours of sleep at night and you're just focused
eating ramen every night.
Yeah.
Or whatever you have to do to to make your dreams come true.
Yeah, and maybe that's fine for a few years, and then you decide that you want something else, or then you decide you want a family. And that, I would say in school they don't really talk about that work-life balance as much as I feel like they should. Some of my grad school classes did, but as an undergrad, that wasn't even mentioned. And I think that's something that is very important, that I think is just as important as getting the tools and also getting the business sense and understanding how to sell yourself and understanding whatever field that you're in. And I think this generally applies to all different fields, not just entertainment. But yeah, I think that's something that should be talked about more.
So I definitely agree that would be helpful. And hopefully, hearing other people just talk about their experiences will help, people kind of decide, what kind of work-life balance that they want to have. And at least have that in mind, that you don't have to go in one direction. And I think sometimes, especially young creative people going into a creative field that might seem kind of like competitive, or that just requires like a lot of like hours to make whatever it is that you're trying to make, and you're still trying to hone your skills. And it's easy to kind of get caught up in a narrative that, I have to work extra hard and extra overtime if I'm going to be able to, to make it in this type of, very competitive field. So I think it's important to be able to bring another perspective, to the table, to say, you can still work on this and be happy and fulfilled, and not have to necessarily sacrifice like everything, for this one thing. You don't have to make that your one and only like self-defining trait, because you don't have time for building any other part of your life.
Yeah, and I also think on the professional side of things, also just having a few things that you can do really well, I think also can help with that. Especially because if you do put all your eggs in one basket, you decide, I want to be a film composer, I want to be the next John Williams, and obviously being the next John Williams, it's a noble ambition. And I mean, I love John Williams' music, both his film scores and even some of his classical music sounds actually really cool. It's not stuff you hear, but I digress. But that's not going to be realistic for the vast majority of people, no matter how talented you are, just from the sheer nature of just how competitive it is, and the combination of the people that John Williams got to work with, which resulted in the scores he was able to create on films that were sold like gangbusters. Like, I think, just considering how big movies like the Indiana Jones and Star Wars, and then later on, I believe he did Harry Potter, like those are all really big names. So I think that also worked in his favor. So sometimes it's also just not like, it's beyond your control too. So if you have some other options of things you can do besides composing, like maybe one of the things you could get interested in doing some recording for people, and or possibly doing orchestration. That's another option. That's not something that I think about personally, because when I'm writing music, for a lot of composers, my understanding is people, they write the music and then they hand it off to somebody else, and then that person fills out the instrumentation for it to be played by an orchestra. And I think because of the fact that as a clarinet player, I played in band and I played in orchestra, like my brain doesn't think that way. I don't think like, oh, I'm going to play a melody and then someone else like takes it and does something with it. Like I hear a melody in my head and it's for the oboe. So I'm doing the orchestration like as I'm composing, but that's something that a lot of composers don't do. So that's an option. Doing music transcription, transcribing things for people. That's something that I've done off and on over the years. And that was actually probably one of the first things that got me work outside of school. Was I started doing some music transcribing for one of my old undergraduate professors shortly after graduating from college, and doing that. And then from there, finding other clients to do stuff for. So that would give me things to do. And I think it helps to give you stuff to do and then just have more things in your portfolio for when that magical opportunity comes that you can say, hey, I've done these different things.
And that's one of the things that, like, I've had a lot of discussions with, kind of this idea of, like, skill acquisition versus mastery, where when you were learning a skill, it might not necessarily take that long to become proficient in it, but then the amount of time invested in boosting that proficiency to mastery level can be just astronomical. And the more time that you spend trying to master something, kind of the smaller returns you get on your time, because the closer you get to mastering, the more and more and more and more you have to work harder to level up, so to speak.
Yes, that's a good analogy.
So yeah, I definitely agree. I spent most of my kind of artistic career just pursuing like mastery, like super laser focused on like one thing. And just in the last couple years, I've been branching out and learning a lot of other software programs and dabbling in a lot of other things, like, you know, doing some programming, doing some live 2D, doing some, you know, just finding that, oh wow, like these other things, like learning how to just do them, maybe not be like the master of them, but like just learning how to do them is like actually pretty fun, and it doesn't actually take as long as I thought it would take, and so then I can branch out and start working in other mediums. And you know, sometimes you might just even just get burnt out after you've been doing the same thing for like 10 years. So
that's also a very good point, is that like being able to also just keep your mind engaged and not get burnt out, because I think it can be very easy for somebody to get burnt out. And if you have the opportunity to then step away for a moment and look at some other things, that can also give that other part of your brain a rest that you may need to then be able to go back and re-engage and have the energy to then, you know, go forward. And I think also just the idea of continuing to learn regardless of what stage you are in your career, I think is also good, just to keep your mind engaged and be wanting to continue to learn and continue to grow, because that process doesn't stop. I think even probably the most experienced veteran people would say the exact same thing, that there's always more to learn and more to grow from. Yeah, I would say probably one of the things that I wish I had heard when I was younger is that this whole process is a journey, and I don't have all the answers. I'm still also on that journey. I'm just maybe a little bit further down the road, but I'm still learning, and I'm still trying to figure things out myself. And I think adults, or at least maybe when we were kids, I felt like adults were kind of up here and that they had things together. And the reality is adults don't really, I mean, I don't, like, they're still growing and learning too. I remember when I was in college that I was talking with one of my professors, I think talking about like career plans and me being concerned about not having all the answers and knowing what I wanted to do at 20, which looking back, that's so silly. But one of the things he said was, well, I'm X number of years older than you, and I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And then one of my other professors happened to walk by and hear that, actually was Mike Anacarico, who was one of my composition teachers. And then he said, well, I'm next number of years older than him, and I still don't know what I want to be when I grow up. And at the time, I took that as, well, okay, you're not supposed to know all the answers, and that's all right. But over the years, I've been thinking about what they said more and more, in that they also are still on the journey. They don't have the answers either, and it's a continuing process that you probably could keep going until you drop dead, basically. And that it's okay if you don't know all the answers, or it's okay if you don't reach a certain checkpoint at a certain time in life. It's everybody's journey is different. Everybody goes at a different speed, and everybody's growing at different rates, and people's priorities are different. So that also affects where you are in your journey, and that it's, you know, it's okay to have your own plan and not to feel like you're supposed to be at a certain point, at a certain level, at a certain point in your life.
It's amazing too how many, like, I feel like as I've been growing older, how many experiences I've had that might seem unrelated to like my art or something that I end up drawing something from. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So like you might have something that you feel like is a distraction from doing your work, but that might be exactly what you need to enrich your work or to give you new perspective. Or when you put it that way, it's almost like, oh, if life was just about like reaching your goal at like 30 or 40 or whatever it is, and then you just stay there for like the remainder of your life, like that sounds pretty boring, actually.
Yeah,
right?
it kind of is. And also I continue to do teaching, and I feel that a lot when I'm teaching, because I'm up there thinking like, I don't feel like I'm all that different than these kids, but I'm obviously older than those kids, and I have more life experience, but I'm still like, kind of at my heart, I'm still kind of that same person that I was, say, in my early 20s. It's just now I just am, again, I'm further down the road on that little path, but I'm still the same person. And that doesn't really change as you get further along in your career. And that was something that I would have felt better if I had just known, like, no, there isn't that magical moment where you suddenly feel different or you're suddenly at like this point.
And I would just add to that something that I would like to tell like younger me also
Yeah.
is that it's like we all want to achieve like mastery, or we want to be the best we can be, but like don't lose sight of enjoying the process. Like you're kind of talking about being on a journey. Like don't be so bent on the end goal that you forget to enjoy your journey as you're going along. I feel like when I was starting out, I saw like this goal that was so far away that, oh my gosh, there's all these people who are so much better than me, and I was just always like beating myself with like a proverbial stick or something. Like I wanted so badly to like to be in a place that I wasn't, that I think I didn't really give myself permission to like really enjoy where I was.
Yeah.
I don't know if you can relate to that.
I definitely can relate to that.
Okay.
That was basically my 20s.
Yeah, that part where you have to get out the garbage first is a rough stage.
Yeah.
Do you think we can give any encouraging advice to people who are still at that kind of that getting their feet wet and having to like deal with that struggle, that initial struggle?
One thing that another composer said to me many years ago, that like 90% of it is just survive, like just being there, like just continuing to just go through the process and not just completely throw in the towel, and just have a presence and just be known, because then eventually people start to recognize what you're doing and what your work is. It's almost as if the skill is important, but it's a lot lower on the list of things to help you move forward than I originally thought.
It's having the consistency or the dedication to just keep going.
Yeah, I think
because a lot of people will burn out and give up.
Yeah, and I see that a lot living out here in Los Angeles. I've had a number of friends over the years that have come and gone to the city, and sometimes that's just what works best for them, but that happens a lot. So I think just continuing, as I described in my 20s, I was treading water a lot of the time, and just continuing to survive, that actually is important, and that's actually a good thing.
Well, maybe it's actually beneficial in the long term that one tries to achieve life balance a little earlier than later, because I definitely had times where I just like totally burnt myself out, and I was able to rebound, but like I would go through these horrible lows when I was like totally burnt out. And for some reason I was under the illusion that such a life was sustainable, that this is the way it's supposed to be. You're supposed to be giving 125%, 200% all the time. But it's just, I don't know that it's humanly possible to sustain.
It's definitely not sustainable, and I'm not trying to say like, you don't need like you still need that fire and you need that motivation. I think it's important that there's a balance between knowing when to push yourself and knowing when you need a rest.
I find that I'm really pretty productive, even if I'm only working on something for like 30 minutes a day, you know? But just if I do it every day, I can get a lot done.
Yeah.
And I don't get burnt out on it. I look forward to it.
Sometimes it's about quality over quantity.
And just also, I think, getting into a habit of doing it in a sustainable way. But if you tried to tell, like, young me to do it in a sustainable way, I wouldn't have listened because I was just too motivated, too driven. But
it's easy to just think in, like, 0 or 60, and there's a lot in between.
Well, thanks again, Carrie, for joining me in this conversation. It's always really fun talking to you.
Well, thanks for having me.